This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Well, there are a number of hurdles. One of them is people wanting to know what to do with violent text. I mean, that's just a question of perhaps people wanting resolution to that question. And so even the way it's asked expects certain things in terms of what an answer would look like or what a response would look like. So I think helping people calibrate expectations for an issue as complicated and nuanced as violence in the Bible, to help people gauge like what would a response you count as a response to this issue, and what should I even be suspicious of? And then probably alongside that, a lot of people wonder like what approach I take, or maybe that I recommend that they should take. And an assumption baked into that question is that there's a method or a key that will unlock this issue. And that was like both of those things are things I wanted to explore in the book. And so on the method side, in the intro, I laid out, I think it was 8 different approaches, and I'm drawing from Roger Olson, who let me use his list, and I modified it. But I suggested that like these different approaches to violence in the Bible each have strengths and limitations, and knowing what they can do is helpful, but a method doesn't help you on the ground to navigate the richness of the biblical text. It might provide some kind of framework and parameters for approaching the question, but once you press into the details, I feel like methods on like hermeneutical methods for addressing this ethical question, you bump up against your limits pretty quickly. And so then the question is like, well, what are you left with if you don't have an approach, say like a Christ-centered reading of the Old Testament that you can use to deal with violence? Then what do you have? And I think what you have is the need to read carefully and slowly through the text and to develop a kind of multi-pronged approach to violence in the Bible. And I think the challenge of that is that it requires a kind of patience that culturally we're, not well suited for. So part of the challenge in writing the book was to make that interesting and engaging, and I tried to pull people in along the way so that it didn't feel like all the homework I put into it. But on the other hand, it didn't feel like you're just glossing over some of the rich aspects of these biblical passages I was engaging.
You and I have talked about violence a lot, and you know my feelings about people over-interpreting violence, or people with the problem of having little contact with the kind of violence that's being described in Scripture, and then trying to interpret the meaning of the violence in Scripture. What would that be like? It would be like, somebody who has had experience with a fire in their kitchen, trying to be a fireman professionally, like going, "Oh, I put out a fire in my pan. I can take that 3-story house." Yeah, exactly.
So I think part of what I put in the intro is like the need to acknowledge our social location and how we're coming to this question, and that doesn't invalidate it. So I think it's easy to overread ourselves into the text, but it's also easy to dismiss ourselves as people with legitimate questions by saying, "Oh, we haven't seen this level of violence, and so what can we say?" Because some people have seen serious violence and have those same questions, and so I think I think the trick is to consider it from all sides. And so remembering, for instance, that while for us, thinking about God's character of judgment or punishment might be the thing we struggle with, for other people, the idea of God extending and showing mercy to a perpetrator of violence is a real problem. I mean, the whole book of Jonah is really about that issue. And so that's what I mean by checking our social location is thinking like of the issue from all sides and remembering what we think is one problem is maybe just good news to someone else.
I think the problem with you, what's wrong with you, is that you have spent all of this time in kind of the biblical thinking and all these different, all the different texts and the different times they're written in and the ways they discuss, even the language that they use. Your Oxford University Press.
Cambridge, yeah.
Yeah, your Cambridge book.
Yeah. Which
even goes in deep on just the very language and categories by which they slice up various types of violence. And so you bring a lot of tools to in a toolbox to this whole discussion that 99% of the rest of us do not have, right? And so you're having to bridge several problems at the same time. The problem that a lot of people don't have experience with the kind of violence that's being described in Scripture. A lot of people don't have experience with the cultures and the kind of the moral expectations of the people who are writing in Scripture. And a lot of us are in the opulent West, and so we don't really understand much of anything of the lifestyle of these people. And then on top of that, they have a way of thinking and talking about violence that is not the way we do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you have this book, Flood and Fury, that is trying to create bridges for people to cross over and to think about these things alongside the biblical authors and various ways in which they might be working these issues out. But it does seem to me that social location is like the number one impediment to understanding what Scripture is doing and even understanding what Jesus is doing with violence. And you note very well, Jesus talks violently a lot, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
but that was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, it's basically I guess whether it's the number one issue. I guess it is a huge one. I think.
Can I give an example too, just to load your gun here? Is I think if you're like teaching biblical narrative, you can basically walk in a room and go, "Hey guys, you know how narrative works. You've watched movies, you've read stories. Like let's go with that, right?" Yeah. But with violence, I figure it feels like almost the exact opposite, where you have to say, really set aside everything you know, and now be ready to relearn. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I guess what I'm hesitating over is the fact that some people, and in the kind of North American context, it's going to be more at the domestic level, but people have experienced serious violence or abuse. And so while it's not the same sort of violence of war, maybe that biblical writers are familiar with in a way that we're not, there's at least a bridge in that sense, an analogy that people have encountered and can and are wrestling at the level of, is God that kind of abusive deity that I experienced in, this church leader, this parent, or whomever. So I think there are some bridges, but it's also good to acknowledge where maybe we are culturally distant from the Bible, and to let it mess with and challenge our assumptions about this subject of violence. And one of the things I think that drives me on in this quest to think through it is that in various ways, biblical and Jewish interpreters throughout history have wrestled with this issue of violence and seen it as something that needs reckoning with, albeit not in the exact same way that we are now. But this is a subject matter that raised consternation for early interpreters and throughout history, later interpreters as well. So, I wouldn't, and I think letting the Bible have its say is a big part of engaging this discussion well. and having the kind of confidence that letting the Bible have its say will yield good news ultimately, not in the interim necessarily, but ultimately good news is a kind of approach or a stance that I think is helpful.
Yeah, and you talk, of course, one of the major subjects about a third of the book is cherem warfare, this idea of, well, I don't even know how devoting to the ban was, I think, the very first phrase I was introduced to, and so that's the one that sticks in my head.
Yeah.
But this style of warfare, and that is commanded in Deuteronomy, and then is carried out in some way. Mm-hmm. And you focus in on, and I like the way the majority. I don't know if you came up with this or not. The majority and the minority report, though.
Yeah.
That there seem to be two different ways of talking about these events, where they're to go in and to kill and to take over land, which both happen. So you want to explain the difference between the majority and the minority reports?
Yeah, I think I got that language in conversation with Brad Jerzak, a friend of mine, and we I was talking to him about these two. I think I used to call it like the primary and the secondary narrative, and he came up with better language. But yeah, so if you read Joshua, you might get whiplash, because on the one hand, the story is told that the people were successful in their military campaigns, and by successful it means they left nothing alive that breathes, and all that God had promised he brought about. He gave them all the land, and they settled the whole land. And so that sounds like job done
and dusted.
Yeah, done and dusted, exactly. And then on the other hand, you have all these stories talking about how it was going to be a gradual process. It was slow displacement. There were Canaanites running around all over the place. And even at the end of Joshua, in the end of the book, in his farewell speech, Joshua is like, much of the land remains unsettled. And so much of it remains in Canaanite hands. And he doesn't say that as a failure. He doesn't describe that as a failure on Israel's part. It wasn't due to their disobedience or anything. And he basically says to them, be sure not to intermarry with or worship the gods that are among these nations. And so in his farewell speech, Joshua almost seems to envision that, like he says, like, God will not continue to displace these nations if you worship their idols. So then you get a picture at the end that the conquest was not up to Israel to complete. Really, their job was to avoid idols. So you have these two narratives in the book, and part of the question I was wrestling with is what do we do with having these kind of interwoven narratives? They're not synoptically, we have to read them synoptically, but they're not separated out like the synoptic gospels.
Right.
It's like
where you can just say there's John's version of the conquest and there's Matthew's version of the conquest.
But in some ways, that's what we have to deal with, or the interaction of those two throughout the book. It's kind of interesting, but it's challenging.
You know, as I was reading your minority majority, and you do this thing with art, Phil Long's, like the different types of art, and the truthfulness of art, which I thought was really good. This is very narcissistic, but I thought, this is kind of me sometimes. I swing really big and absolutist in some arguments, like at the front, just like, well, no, that would never, ever be the case. And then I kind of back off the argument a little bit as people start pointing things out.
A friend of mine one time, he told me I should read this book on comics and how they're by Scott McCloud. It's like a classic book on comic art. And part of what he describes in the book is that, like, when he uses a stick figure, or a very simplified human drawing, to talk about how when you simplify a picture down to its essential elements, as a kind of caricature, you're not so much eliminating the truth of that picture, but you're homing in on like the core key elements, right? So it's a way of And I think literature works in a similar way. Rhetorically, what that majority report is doing is highlighting this high call of discipleship, of undivided loyalty to Yahweh, of God's utter and complete faithfulness without nuance, utter faithfulness to his promises. Okay, so that can be true, and alongside that can be the messy realities of life. And I think the book wants us to take up both of those stories as true and hold them together.
Could you say something similar? I'm just thinking of other spots like of Yahweh worship itself, that they're supposed to be committed to all these festivals, but maybe the reality is they're not making all the pilgrimages, or they're not doing it correctly. Or even that you find idols in almost every Hebrew house that they excavate, right? And you say like, okay, and so people say, oh, they weren't monotheists, and you're like, well, maybe they're kind of monotheist, but not really the kind we think of.
They certainly had an ideal, and the strange thing is that if you read Deuteronomy, you get the impression that if there was even the mention of another god on the mouth of any Israel, or if there were idols found, then basically what you should do is wipe out that family, that town entirely, and show them no mercy, right? So
it feels very much like ancient Near Eastern law. They kind of remove the center post of their house and let it collapse upon them.
Yeah, may every beam be pulled out of your house and be flayed alive. So that's the impression you get from Deuteronomy, and you think like, oh my goodness, like this is a horrifically violent culture. And then at the end of Joshua, it's interesting in his farewell speech when he's saying sayonara to the people, he says to them, be sure to put away the idols that are among you. He says it twice.
It's after the back and forth, because they're like, choose this day who you're going to serve. And they're like, we're going to serve Yahweh. And he's like, no, you can't.
And also like to get rid of the idols that are among you, the Israelites. Right. So Joshua knew that they had idols among them. And he doesn't say, now I'm going to send around some troops and we're going to stab some people's families here because you've violated the covenant. So in practice, Joshua is portrayed as a Torah observant, like Torah loyal leader. Like that's defining of his character. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua's life. And so that's remarkable. How can a people have served the Lord if they had idols among them? And I think that's where the messy reality of real life hits the ground in Joshua, where he doesn't say, you need to exterminate all these families. And also he says, don't intermix with the idols of the nations around that are remaining among you in the land. He doesn't say at the end of his life, now go exterminate the rest of them. So that suggests to me that the book itself treats to some level, this doesn't resolve everything, but it treats to some level that rhetoric of totality and destruction rhetorically. So take it seriously, but not. It was taken seriously, but not literally. And I think that's important.
I can imagine people then saying like, "Oh, well, it sounds like you're just trying to say the Bible is just it's just this rhetorical device making all of these rhetorical moves." And you can think of some obvious spots. Jesus saying, "Not a single stone of the temple is going to be unturned." And we have to think, did he literally mean? No single stone was going to be left unturned.
Yeah, because the retaining wall.
That would. Good luck with that, buddy. Right? Yeah, not even the Romans could. But I mean, do you have like a continuum for rhetoric that you think about, or how you think about how we should take it in what sense?
Yeah, I think sometimes we have to think analogously about places where Jesus says, you can't be my disciples unless you hate your father, mother, brother, and sister. So, I mean, that's something Jesus wanted. He doesn't then rush to say, I'm just joking, or like, I don't mean it that way. He lets the severity of that demand fall upon his audience. And because he wants them to take it seriously. But I don't think he wants them to take it literally. I mean, of course, depending on how you understand the terminology around hate. But let's take it as hate in our sense. Like, I don't think Jesus wanted his disciples to literally hate their families. But it's a way of expressing the undivided loyalty that he required of his followers. And I think in a similar way, that rhetoric in Deuteronomy about leaving none alive that breathes sits alongside texts where it talks about being utterly and solely devoted to Lord. In fact, Deuteronomy 7, where the herem or total destruction command comes right after Deuteronomy 6, which is all about, or at least in the beginning there, about total whole person loyalty to Yahweh.
And, I mean, also Deuteronomy 6 through 9 is repetitive.
Yeah.
Don't think that any of this is by the strength of your hand.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
This is highly anti-meritocratic thread going on there.
Yeah. And the end of Joshua even picks up on that and talks about how it wasn't by their sword that they won victory in the land. So it's like,
which is really enigmatic because it's and the hornet of God is in there from Exodus. He makes this weird reappearance. And
and I should say that like this rhetorical aspect of that, that harem command still leaves you with questions, like, because there are stories in Joshua, like in Jericho, and then the military campaigns in 10 and 11, where it does seem to describe the people taking that command literally. Yeah. So you're still left with that issue. So I'm not saying that Israel never tells a story of the people applying it literally. And that's where I think a lot of the challenge comes. But I think framing it initially in those rhetorical terms is a kind of first step. And
certainly Samuel the prophet seems to take it literally with Amalek, right?
Yeah. 1 Samuel 15. Yeah.
And also David in 1 Samuel 27, I think it's around there. Like he commits harem, right? He goes against the villages and the Negev. He claims to Achish, his captor, that he's actually going against his own brothers.
Yeah.
But I mean, it almost has to be literal there because the whole purpose of him killing every man and woman was so that nobody could snitch on him.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Blows cover.
Yeah.
So I think, and then I do talk about that in the book about like, what do we do with Jericho? And I think there are other tools available for reckoning with it. Along the way, I think we have to ask ourselves, like, are we domesticating something we are uncomfortable with, or are we reading the text well? And so I always want to read along the grain of the text and bring historical insights where that helps, or cultural insights, but allow some of this stuff to just sit uncomfortably with us and then work on what we do with that.
Yeah, and you bring in the archaeology of Jericho in the book, and I always have big questions about the archaeology of Jericho because it's kind of contingent on what date you think there might have been some kind of exodus, however you think the exodus happened.
Yeah.
And then there seem to be some very highly contested, I will just say that, it's very highly contested what you consider the destruction layer, when do you consider the destruction layer, when do you think Hebrews have entered the land. So I wonder if we can, it seems like any account of violence in Jericho can't hang its hat on the actual data at this point, right?
Yeah, I think what we can say is the best that we know. And this is where, like, there are some approaches that I think are a bit disingenuous in that they either manipulate the available data, or they assume that, for instance, the presence of late bronze material, like late Bronze Age is when Israel is said to have gone into the land, that the presence of some material from the late Bronze Age means that it was a fully fledged occupied city.
Right.
And so the best we can say, if you take a late dating for the Exodus, which is what I I suggest, and I think is a decently
late is 1250
Yeah.
or around 1250.
Yeah, 1200 or so. Is that it doesn't seem like there was an occupation layer at that time. But there is some evidence of material culture from that time period. So it might have been a previously decent size, Middle Bronze city that was occupied by a military outpost at that time. And that changes our picture a bit of what Jericho might have been. And again, this is all contingent, but I'm going with like the best that I think we can reconstruct things. So it was likely, I think, a smallish city, a town or outpost. Like think about like a military outpost that was guarding the way up to Jerusalem,
like
right?
Arad down in the south.
Yeah. And so then when we hear language about killing every man, woman, child, and animal, it's very likely it wasn't occupied by many women and children, and that these are like potentially military folks that are just guarding this spot. Again, that's not certain. The story tells us Rahab was there, but the idea that soldiers would have a prostitute is not the does not yet tell you if this is a normal kind of larger city. So, like thinking through the particulars, I think is helpful to just imagine like the possibilities and likelihood of what was there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as you keep saying in the book, like at the end of the day, that doesn't get you out of the violence. Mm-hmm. Like there is some level of violence orchestrated by God. Even if you want to say it was the hornet of God himself that committed the majority of it, and the humans were just a cleanup crew. It's still something like that going on. So I wonder for people who are going to say, "Oh, thank God this is the Old Testament, and we don't have to worry about this kind of stuff anymore because we're New Testament Christians, and all of this violence goes away." How would you complicate that narrative for the little Marcionites in us?
Yeah, I think I would say that I would go back again to the idea that these are the stories that shaped Jesus's ethic and teaching and life, and so the Hebrew Scriptures are Jesus's formative educational environment. And whatever we love in Jesus is somehow rooted in these texts and nourished his imagination as a teacher and prophet and rabbi in Israel. So I think we can't set these two against each other. Also, there's a fair dose of violence in the New Testament. So whether you take it rhetorically or literally, the language about hellfire is ain't so peaceful.
It
right?
seems intentionally violent.
Yeah, and
it's intentionally scary. At
stuff,
least.
And Jesus had some hard words of judgment, and perhaps rightfully so, about millstones around necks and the destruction of Jerusalem. He seems to have, Jesus. I think he prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, and if you look at that event, that was. And you read Josephus, that was extremely.
That's about as gnarly as it gets as far as wide-scale violence.
Yeah, so I don't want to swing to the other extreme and be like, Jesus is actually pretty violent. But because I think that needs reflection and thought too. But it does at least complicate that trajectory from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And this gets back at those method questions, because one method is to say that a progressive revelation, that as we get on in Scripture, we get a clearer picture, a fuller picture of who God is. And I think that's true to some extent, so it's a helpful way of thinking. But on the other hand, if you expect a kind of movement from violence to peace, I think you're in for disappointment. But similarly, you're in for a surprise if you read the Old Testament carefully regarding the vision of peace that's there and of God's mercy and grace and forgiveness.
it has struck me several times when I think, probably when I'm reading your books, that Jesus does not say, when he talks about the eschaton, the end of his return, he does not say, as it was in the days of Jericho.
Yeah.
So it will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Which, if Jericho was like the paradigmatic doing horrible things, and again, that's a whole other question for me. Like, what is it that Jericho deserved exactly, or Ai, or any of the other ones? But it's not the paradigm for God's judgment. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think that comes from the fact that in the book of Joshua, it's not the wickedness of those places that's really featured, at least in the book of Joshua. That does come out elsewhere in Deuteronomy and whatnot. But whereas in Genesis, the flood story, it does foreground human wickedness and particularly violence as the precipitating cause of the flood. And so that might be why. I don't have any more thoughts on that.
It's just odd that it's a very clear connect. The flood, it's Flood and Fury is the name of your book, right? The flood. Yeah. It's very clear. Whatever it was their wickedness and the violence that, as you say, ruined the ground. Yeah. And in Sodom, you get a very clear picture of exactly what kind of violence people are perpetrating that ruins the city and makes them destroyable, I guess. But then with Jericho and Ai and Hatzor, and you just don't know. You kind of have to import ideas from Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Right. Yeah, and I think part of the challenge for Joshua is that it doesn't describe what's happening there as violence, perpetrated by Israel. So that's our interpretation of that, and I think it's fair. But we just have to recognize that we were operating with a lens that the writers probably didn't have or didn't use to think about what that conquest was. And I think maybe that's in part because of the justice of what they saw, but even that doesn't come into the picture. I think it's I think the book was doing something else in how it's telling that story. And really, like, when you get to the end of the book, what it's worried about is the ongoing presence of idolatry within Israel. And lurking around them in some ways too, their neighbors and within them. And one of the things I bring out in the book is that, like, in many ways, Joshua is not about the evil other that lurks out there. That's not the primary thing, because the people, as they go into the land, it turns out in chapter 5, they're uncircumcised. And at the end of the book, they're idolatrous. And so you get this picture of Israel of uncircumcised, idolatrous people who need to clean up matters within as much as they do deal with external threats. And I think that's the kind of thing where, like, the church should ask questions as they read Joshua about, like, the way they're framing the dangers to the church. Like, to the extent that we situate all threats and dangers out there, we're probably not doing enough, like, self-examination. I think Joshua really challenges that in so many ways, whether it be like defining who's in and who's out by juxtaposing Rahab and Achan, or calling Israel to deal with all those problems within their community.
And so there's this other weird form of, I don't know if you can even call it violence, but it's a problem of intermarriage. And the irony of that is people are intermarrying throughout, Israel's history. Their greatest heroes are intermarrying with people from other generations. So what do you think is the most problematic aspect, or what do they mean by intermarriage? Because they're going to go on to describe people who get intermarried, and it's not a problem. They're not getting their hair pulled out and beat by Nehemiah.
And there's even a rabbinic tradition that Joshua marries Rahab. So I think that tradition, which doesn't come from the book of Joshua, highlights the reality that Israel recognized a legitimate place for intermarriage with non-Israelites, even Canaanites. And so it's not just about the ethnicity of who's married, or I should say it's not about the ethnicity of who's married. Instead, it's about covenant fidelity most fundamentally. And so there's a whole book in the Bible about this, namely the book of Ruth, where Ruth is a Moabite, according to Deuteronomy 23, technically excluded from the community. But I think the law was never meant to be ruthlessly applied. I just thought of that as I was saying it. That was terrible. Anyway, yeah. It wasn't meant to be ruthlessly applied. There's a place for Ruth at the table, and it's on the basis of covenant embrace. And so Rahab is situated at the beginning of Joshua, I think, as a legal question for the readers to think through. And she's not an exception that they had to consider. She's actually like closer to the heart of what they need to think about. And
if you work through the law, the foreigner inclusion is not just one spot. It's happening all over the place. Yeah.
And so I think that the Bible is constantly training us to think in terms of what's primary, what's secondary, and how to relate those things. Classic example of like if your ox falls in the ditch on the Sabbath, like should you get it out, right? So preserving life is justified on the Sabbath because that has a primacy. And Jesus talks about mercy being more fundamental than sacrifice, not because sacrifice didn't matter, but because he reads along the grain of the Old Testament where they were able to prioritize certain things over others. So Rahab is a story that I think is challenging readers to think through the primacy of welcoming the Canaanite who embraces Yahweh over any command that would say she should be eliminated. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah. And if you could just thought experiment, if Ruth was a devoted worshiper of Chemosh or Molech,
I don't.
We'd say, it would be a no-go, right?
Yeah. I don't think so. So it's not just as simple as are foreigners included or excluded. There are other issues at play, and I think Isaiah 56 really gets at this. With the eunuch and the foreigner, they're included as covenant keepers and people who are embracing the covenant. And so their foreignness or their eunuchness doesn't take priority over their embrace of Torah. And in fact, it's a faithful enactment of Torah.
And that's not a unique way of looking at it either.
That
was meant to be a pun.
Oh, unique. Got it. Yeah, ruthless and unique. Yeah, I think because one way to read those texts like Ruth or Isaiah 56 is to see them subverting the law, and I don't, or Joshua 2. I think we like subversive stories, and we like a prophet who's edgy. We like stories that are edgy, but I actually think they're reading Torah faithfully and showing that this is the way these laws are meant to be held together.
I think the most controversial thing I say when I'm in front of a group of Christians that I don't know, when I'm just speaking to somebody, is I'll often point out like that not all of Scripture is primary. Like it's not equally primary, right? Like some parts take primacy over other parts. And you can see people like looking up in their head, doing the Rolodex, like, wait, is that true? And, and they just never really thought about, even within the law, there is primacy.
Yeah, it sounds like another manifestation of the idea that all sin is equal.
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
No, murdering is worse than speaking a word in I don't know, like breaking a vow even, right? Like a small vow.
Not if you're just trying to get your soul into heaven.
Yeah, but I guess the flat reading of the text, like you're missing the cues that the Bible's giving us to help us navigate its own rocky terrain.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, Dr. Matthew Lynch, thank you for this book, Flood and Fury, Old Testament Violence and the Shalom of God. We didn't even get to the shalom part, but I predict that it will win a book cover award because it's got a beautiful book cover.
The designers did a great job, as did the editors helping with the book.
And the content ain't bad either. So
yeah, remains to be seen. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Matt,
for
your time and your wisdom here.
Happy to do it.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.